Good afternoon. My name is Gary McDowell from the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and with my colleague Terry Price, I'm the co-director of the John Marshall International Center for the Study of Statesmanship, and it's our pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this lecture by Gordon Wood in our series of lectures on statesmanship and great events such as the American founding. We're more than pleased to have with us one of America's truly distinguished historians. Gordon Wood is the Alva Way Emeritus University Professor at Brown University, where he has taught since 1969. 1969 was a momentous year. That was the year when a lot of us who could have been rich lawyers became impecunious academics because he published The Creation of the American Republic, and it changed our lives immeasurably for good. He's gone on to publish other things, including The Radicalism of the American Revolution, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1993. And most recently, the book we're here to celebrate tonight, Empire of Liberty, the history of the early republic, 1789 to 1850. We're glad that you can be with us. Professor Wood will speak, and then he'll take questions, and then we'll have a book signing and a reception. Thank you for being with us. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be my first visit to the university, and I'm very impressed. I also know your president, and you made a good choice. This book, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I've been on a book tour, so this is the part of it. But this book, the title of which comes from Jefferson, Empire of Liberty. That's a term he used. He had a very expansive view of the United States. In fact, I think he probably was the most expansive-minded president in our history. He had ambitions to take a lot of territory, including, at one point, he thought Cuba would become part of the United States. Anyway, that's his Empire of Liberty. Now, he didn't think of empire in the conventional meaning of the term. He thought of it as a vast government, but certainly was going to be a liberal government. Now, I introduced the book with a short account of the famous story, maybe not so famous to many of you younger people, but Rip Van Winkle, which was Washington Irving's best-selling story, his most popular story. He wrote it in the second decade of the 19th century, and I think the story, of course, is Rip goes to sleep, wakes up, and finds, as a consequence of the revolution, everything's changed. And he's totally bewildered by the changes. I think this was Irving, who had conservative sensibilities, his attempt to explain what had happened in his own lifetime, the changes that had taken place in America. The language was strange, he says. The rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, liberty, and other words were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. When people asked him on which side he voted, whether he was federal or a Democrat, Rip can only stare in vacant stupidity. I think that was an exaggeration, but nonetheless captured the feelings of lots of people, because this story resonated with his readers and became, as I say, the most popular of his stories. In a few short decades, Americans had really transformed themselves. Before the Revolution, Americans had been merely a collection of disparate British colonies composed of some 2 million subjects along a narrow strip of the Atlantic coast, European outposts whose cultural focus was still the metropolitan center in London. By 1815, following the Second War of Great Britain, and this book of mine it's part of the Oxford History series. The period I was given to write about is 1789 to 1815. So following that war with Britain, these insignificant provinces had become a single giant continental republic with nearly 10 million citizens, many of whom were already spilling over the mountains into the west. And their cultural focus was no longer London, but instead was directed inward at its own boundless possibilities. So Americans knew they were a great experiment in republicanism and in enlightenment. In a sense, they could believe that they could do anything. They could solve any problem, including the climate. They could recreate what they believed, what they thought. Their whole culture could be transformed. And of course, the revolution was all about the fact that people's birth did not limit what you might become. hence the importance they gave to education. More pamphlets, more books, more articles were written about education relative to population in this period than at any time in our history. Now, they didn't get implemented. Jefferson's plan for this state, for example, gets put aside because it seemed to cost too much for the legislature. But nonetheless, the ideas were carried into the next generation and began to be implemented in the 1840s and 50s. But they were laid out. Jefferson's three-tiered system is essentially what we have today. He's not the only one. He was just the most famous person who laid out ideas for education, very much a part of this period. They were faced real problem when you think about it. How do you identify yourself? What is an American? Even the term itself seemed vague. After all, in South America, North America, everybody had a claim to the title Americans who lived in the New World. So what would they call themselves? They had recently been British. How did they establish their identity? It was a real problem. They started experimenting with names like Columbians. That coincided with the 1792 celebration of Columbus's discovery. But that didn't stick. Samuel Mitchell, who was a senator, a physician, and a senator from New York, came up with the idea of Freedonians. We're Freedonians and we live in Freedonia, but of course that didn't stick either. They ended up with the United States of America, and we became Americans, much to the chagrin of the Canadians and the Colombians and the Venezuelans who feel, well, we're Americans too. Why should this big country claim that title? They had ambitions that looking back, seemed grandiose, utopian. They thought they would capture the torch of Western civilization was going to be passed to them, and that they would illuminate it even more. They would create the kind of illustrious culture that people, since the Greeks and Romans, had only yearned for. Now, little worked out the way they expected. The elites, the founders, as we often call them. The society became much more popular, much more democratic than they even expected. And I think in a generation's time, these people experienced as great a transformation as we've ever had in our history. Now, those of us of a certain age know that since the 1960s, we've undergone an immense transformation in American life. Race relations, women's rights, sexual mores. I mean, think of the changes. But I would submit that this generation that I'm talking about experienced even a greater transformation, and without any technological advances. I mean, there are no railroads, there are no computers, there's no telegraph, nothing of that sort, but nonetheless, they were transformed in I think, an extraordinary way. The population grew dramatically, as it had been, of course, through the 18th century, doubling every 20 years. Now, that's a rate of growth that was twice as fast as any European country at the time. So that was the kind of the major fundamental source of change. But the people were also on the move, spreading themselves unevenly over half a continent at astonishing speeds. Between 1790 and 1820, New York's population quadrupled. Kentucky's multiplied nearly 8 times. In a single generation, Ohio, which had virtually no white people in it at the beginning of the 19th century, grew from a virtual wilderness to be as large as any of the colonial states, colonial colonies were on the eve of the Revolution, 500,000 people in a decade's time. Enormous kind of growth. The Americans occupied more territory in the single generation that I'm talking about than they did in the entire colonial period. And of course, in the process, displaced tens of thousands of native peoples. Now, although most Americans remained farmers, 19 out of 20 were rural people working a farm, they had become, particularly in the North, especially commercial people. I think the most highly commercialized society in the world, meaning that most people were engaged in buying and selling. Not just with the outside world, but with one another. And that was hard for people to believe was a source of prosperity. There was it took it's counterintuitive to them that people selling, I don't know, say between Fredericksburg and Richmond could actually increase the pie of the state of Virginia, that the prosperity of Virginia could go up between that kind of trade. If you think about it, it doesn't make much sense. How do you, well, they wrestled with that, and they finally, by the early 19th century, people had come to understand that trading between two cities, two towns in the same state could enhance the prosperity of that state. And that becomes a major intellectual breakthrough as they begin celebrating business. And this is particularly true in the North, of course, not so much here in Virginia, although in Richmond had a certain commercial center. John Marshall, as a Federalist, came out of Richmond. The celebration of work becomes very important. And of course, that made as the North comes to celebrate work in a way that went way beyond anything that the French or the British were doing at the time. That made the leisured slaveholding aristocracy in the South more and more anomalous. Slavery was widely condemned, but of course it didn't die in the new United States. And it flourished, but only in the South. By 1804, every northern state had moved to abolish slavery. But slavery spread across the southern half of the country, and as it disappeared in the North, it became more deeply entrenched in the southern economy. And in a variety of ways, both cultural, social, and political, the South began to see itself by the end of the period as a beleaguered minority in a bustling commercial nation. Now, I have to understand, Virginia, your Virginia, in 1790 was, well, it was the nation. I mean, it was a fifth of the population. It dominated the country. It was by far the biggest, richest state in this new United States. And it's not surprising that 4 out of the first 5 presidents were Virginians. As Virginia went, so went the nation. It's not surprising, too, that the plan, the working model for the Constitution, was the Virginia plan. If Virginia didn't go along with something, it just didn't happen. That's and that's important. It has a lot to do with their attitude towards slavery, because in the outset, in the 1780s and 90s, Virginians were moving to abolish slavery, it seemed, and there were real steps taken. And I think it led to misleading views of what was going to happen. By 1815, Virginia is still a larger state in population, but it's a very different place. Its soil is depleted. It's not growing cotton the way South Carolina or Mississippi and Alabama. Its principal export by the second decade of the 19th century, unfortunately, was slaves to Mississippi and Alabama. Those are some of the changes. And I want to go through some of the basic points that occurred in this period. You all know about the titanic struggle between Hamilton on Washington on one side and Jefferson on another. This is not just politics as usual. It's not the first party system. None of them liked parties. They didn't think parties were a good thing. The Federalists, led by Hamilton and Washington, never saw themselves as a party. They were the beleaguered government being beset by these radical Republicans. Jefferson's Republicans did see themselves as a party, but a temporary one. They said it's only necessary, as the Whigs were the Patriot Whigs were in the 1760s and 70s, to combat monarchism. And as long as the threat of, and they thought the Federalists were monocrats, with some justification, as long as the monocrats are a threat, we will be a party, but as soon as that threat is removed, our party will disappear. That was the vision. But they had 2 different conceptions of the state. And so you have a fundamental fight in the 1790s over what kind of nation the United States should be. Hamilton and Washington bought into it, wanted a fiscal military state similar to those of Europe. He wanted to make the United States the equal of Great Britain in every way. It would have a bureaucracy, a standing army, all of the and a naval force, all of the attributes of a modern state, so that we could take on the Brits at some later date on their terms. That's his vision. He wants to be a European-type state. and had all kinds of implications for the way you treat power and particularly military force. Jefferson and Madison had a very different view. Not just an agrarian state, but a state that would not emulate Europe in any way. They have a really radical, some would say utopian, Hamilton thought it was a pie-in-the-sky dream world. They wanted a world, a kind of state that would show the world that democracy and republicanism and democracy become interchangeable terms in this period. The Republicans started as Republicans. By the second decade, they're being called the Democrats. And they are the origins of the Democratic Party. They had a very different vision of what the United States would be. Not a European-type state. We're not going to have a bureaucracy. We're not going to have a huge army or navy. Those are the sources of executive power, monarchical-type power, and that's not where we want to go. We're going to have alternatives to the use of military force. We're going to, and this, of course, lies behind the grand experiment with what we would call economic sanctions, the embargo. It has earlier versions in withholding of American trade. It goes back actually to the non-importation agreements in the 1760s and 70s to bring pressure on the British. Withhold your trade, use your trade, your commerce as a weapon. And Jefferson saw that as an alternative to the use of military force. We still do. I mean, that's what we're talking about with Iran. We don't want to bomb Iran. We want to somehow put pressure on them by using commercial forces, commercial withholding trade of some sort. So that Jefferson's dream was really a magnificent dream in a way, shared by liberals all over the 18th century, from Jefferson to Kant, to create a universal peace, to avoid war, which they thought was the most terrible of things. Which had been the source of monarchical power's growth over the previous 3 centuries. They're going to change history, if you will, by these kinds of experiments. So you have politics, however, becoming democratized under the feet, so to speak, of these founding fathers, as more and more people gain the right to vote. But in fundamental ways, the gentry world of the 18th century, where people stood for election, is replaced by the second decade of this 19th century, the period from 1810 to 1820, already replaced by a recognizably modern world of competing professional politicians who ran for office under the banners of a political party. Now, I think we usually think of the Jacksonian era as the era of the common man, but I think that's kind of a mistake. I think that the Jacksonian period is a period of consolidation, trying to bring this licentious democratic world under control. When you think of Jackson's use of the bureaucracy, the bureaucracy grows by leaps and bounds under Jackson. Also the use of patronage, which Hamilton tried using as a source of integrating the society, the spoils system that Jackson built up. All of these are efforts to control the democracy that is already in existence. And I think that democratization occurs very rapidly in the 1790s and the early decades of the 19th century, mostly in the northern states. And it's marked by the emergence of new men into authority, men who lacked any of the social or moral credentials that the founders had. You have interesting examples. For example, Daniel Tompkins. This is a sign of what was happening as early as the first decade of the 19th century. Ordinary people coming in. Edmund Randolph complained that complained that the Congress was full of too many ordinary folk. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry, he says, the refuse of the retail trade of politics was getting into authority. Even butchers were ending up in the Congress, the federal Congress. And even when they were not ordinary, this is what's most extraordinary, many people now begin to find that it's good politics to pretend that you're a common man. In his campaign for governor of New York, 1807, Daniel Tompkins, who was a successful lawyer, a graduate of Columbia College, portrayed himself as a simple farmer's boy. That was his campaign slogan. In contrast, he said to his opponent, Morgan Lewis, who was an in-law of the aristocratic Livingston family. In 1810, the Federalists, New York Federalists, were going to get back at Tompkins to combat Tompkins with their own plebeian candidate, a man named Jonas Platt, whose habits and manners, said the Federalists, were as plain and Republican as those of his country neighbors. Platt was not a city lawyer like Tompkins, who rolls in splendor and wallows in luxury. So already you've got that kind of anti-intellectualism, anti-elitism, which became the stuff of American politics already by the first decade in the northern states spreading. And of course, that's still an aspect of our politics. I mean, the Sarah Palin business last year has a lot of that element, and some of her appeal comes from the same kind of feeling that was being expressed in the first decade. The classic example of this is in Pennsylvania. Simon Snyder, no education whatsoever, never been to college, he's self-educated. He knows how to read. He works himself up, but he's not stupid. He just is ignorant, if you might say, which a lot of people said about Sarah Palin. She may not be very well read, but no one accuses her of being stupid. But Snyder works himself up to become governor of the state of Pennsylvania in 1808. And he wore his simplicity and his lack of sophistication as a badge of honor. When his opponents mocked his obscure origins and called his followers clodhoppers, he and his supporters shrewdly picked up the epithet and began wearing it proudly. And so he's in a society of clodhoppers. He says, I am a clodhopper, and that's why you clodhoppers should vote for me, and that's why he won. I mean, that's a very different kind of politics from anything that had occurred on a scale where man is winning governorships by playing down by enhancing his obscure origins and playing to the fact that he is uneducated and just a clodhopper. And in fact, I think Americans became so thoroughly democratic, in the North in particular, in this period, that much of the period's political activity, beginning with the Constitution itself, which was an attempt to raise decision-making, get it out of the states where you could get a better class of person making decisions at the federal government. And most of the efforts were made through the whole period were to finding means and devices to tame and mitigate the democracy. One of the principal means for this, and I spend 2 chapters in this huge book on the courts and judiciary. The Federalists, probably apart from creating the Constitution, and maybe you can say Hamilton's financial program, but one of their great achievements was creating a federal court system, which is not prescribed in the Constitution. All the Constitution calls for is a Supreme Court. It leaves to Congress to create a court system, and many people felt that we don't need a separate federal court system. We can rely on the state courts. But the Federalists created an elaborate court system, which is essentially the kind of court system we have today, a 3-tiered system. I think more important than the right to vote, which is really not the crucial element in democracy, you know, voting is hardly the measure of any democratic society, as we know from seeing it around the world. What Americans develop in this period, ordinary Americans, is a keen sense of their own worth, which was unprecedented in the history of the world. With the call for equality, using equality, which had been made famous, of course, by the Declaration, all men are created equal, but it becomes more than just being created equal. Equality becomes the means by which people challenge powerful, entrenched elites. And equality, of course, becomes the most important ideological force in our entire history. Lincoln uses it, Martin Luther King uses it, and it's used today, used by women and gays and others. It's a very powerful force, intellectual force, and the most, I think, in our history, most important in our history. The aristocracy is put on the defensive. They didn't use the term elites, but aristocracy was the term they used to describe anybody who had any pretensions to being superior to somebody else. And it was a kind of an extraordinary moment where people could not take for granted their superiority to others. You have democratization everywhere, including the democratization of ambition, which hitherto in Western culture had always been an aristocratic passion. I mean, think of Shakespeare's plays. The common people are comic characters. They don't have real ambition. It's the Macbeths of the world that do great things, but they also are dangerous. And of course, that's how people thought about Hamilton or Burr. These are great men, great-souled men, going back to Aristotle. These are the sources of great achievement. They're heroic individuals, but they're also dangerous. And that was the conception. They're ambitious. They want to do mighty things. Now, all of a sudden, you have a kind of, how to put it, a taming or a democratization of this notion of ambition. And people begin saying every American is ambitious. All they want to do is get ahead. They don't want to do great deeds. They just want to make a little more money and do better than their parents did. Now, it's not the kind of ambition. They were aware, many of these founders began from very obscure origins. John Adams, even Jefferson, his father was not a college graduate. And Franklin, of course, is the most obscure origins, but they assimilate into gentry status and become aristocratic. But what you have with these common people now is that they're not becoming aristocrats, they're not even becoming gentlemen in the usual sense of the term, but they are ambitious. And what I find, they've got small little increments that they want to have, but they're not people to be feared. In the way you'd have to fear the ambition of a Hamilton or a Burr. What's most extraordinary is that they were aware of this. James Sullivan, governor of Massachusetts in 1807, grasped the significance of what he saw happening in his own society. He suggested that a man who sought only to acquire property is not perhaps the great man for whom one would dare to die, but he is a character whom one no need to fear. Indeed, by advancing his own particular interest in an innocuous, piecemeal way, the ordinary man, said Sullivan, even advances the interest of the public. So this is an incredible insight, I think, into what was happening in a way that, that was unprecedented in the history of the world, that ordinary people could actually see themselves moving up the social structure in this innocuous, commercial-ridden society. Now you have, this is only some of the great changes that take place and I try to deal with them. The society was so licentious, so rambunctious, really almost running out of control, particularly in the North, that it is instability everywhere, and it shows up in a number of ways. And let me just suggest some of those ways. Violence of all sorts increases to unprecedented levels. Personal violence became much more common than it was in England, for example. Homicide rates in the Chesapeake area here reversed a century of decline and increased dramatically in the decades following the Revolution. Homicides in New York take off in the 1790s, sudden rise. And you have an increase in family murders. More family murders, that is, a husband killing his whole family, his wife and his kids. Charles Brockden Brown's Whelan came out of that newspaper report of these, were more in this period than in any other time in the 19th century. So urban rioting became much more destructive. They'd been used to rioting in the colonial period, but it was always elite, condoned or dominated. Now the riots are against the elite and much more destructive of lives and property. Drinking reached an all-time high in America, a symptom of this kind of instability. It reached 5 gallons per person per year, the highest in American history, before or since. In fact, it was the highest in the world, according to studies that have been made, of any nation in the Western world at least, with the possible exception of Scotland, who seemed... and when you think about it, 5 gallons maybe doesn't seem much if you count every man, woman, and child, but then also think of a fifth of the population was enslaved. They didn't have much access to alcohol, so the figures are even higher. And of course, this breeds the temperance movement that emerges at the end of the 20s and takes off in the 30s, that climaxes a century later with, nearly a century later with Prohibition. John Adams was frightened. He says, we're becoming a nation of drunkards. Little town of Peacham, Vermont, 1,500 people had 30 distilleries. Washington was very upset about the growth of drinking, but of course he had a distillery at Mount Vernon. Wheat farmers, grain farmers found it so much easier because wheat is such a perishable, grain is perishable, it's not easily transported, transportation problems were enormous. How do you get your stuff to market? Well, you distill it into whiskey and it doesn't perish, and it's a great product. So people were drinking all day long. Dram breaks instead of coffee breaks. Bottles of whiskey would be passed around the courtroom during a trial. The judge would have some, the jury, the prosecuting. I mean, they were drinking all day long, a huge drinking problem, which led to all the abuses of alcohol as well. Women beaten, wives beaten, and so on. Rioting among college students. Never before or since have we had such rioting among students. Between 1798 and 1808, that decade, the colleges were racked by mounting incidents of student defiance and rebellion on a scale, as I say, unprecedented and not duplicated since. We always think of the 1960s as a period of student unrest, but that's tame compared to what happened back then. Colleges would be closed for weeks on end because they couldn't meet any classes. Whole classes, half a class would be expelled. Now, the classes weren't that big, 120 students, but 60 of them expelled at one time. Nassau Hall at Princeton burned to the ground. As a result, presumably, it was during a student riot. No one knows quite what happened. So you have a incredible kind of period which befuddled everyone. They didn't know what was the cause. French thinking, rich kids, too much money, too much drinking, all of that. And they worried about what's happening to our society with our youth, the way we worried about the 1960s. Religion, too, was democratized and transformed. We forget, but prior to the Revolution, there are no Methodists in the colonial period, late as the 1760s, not a single Methodist in America. The dominant religions in the 18th century were the Anglicans, established church, weakly established, except in this colony, but established church Anglicans or the Puritans in New England, Congregationalists or Presbyterians. By the first decade of the 19th century, the dominant religion, the Methodists, followed very closely by the Baptists. They come out of nowhere. The evangelical Baptists and the evangelical these new denominations of Methodists. The Methodists proliferated so much because they had no trained clergy. They had horseback itinerant preachers who barely could read, but they could quote the Bible, and they brought in converts by the thousands. And it's an extraordinary change in a short period of time. And this evangelical religion spread everywhere. The most famous gathering of religious seekers took place in the summer of 1801 at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. They are huge numbers of people, numbering in tens of thousands, with ministers, dozens of ministers preaching at the same time in different parts of the camp. They came together in what some people thought was the greatest outpouring of the Holy Spirit since the beginning of Christianity. Huge crowds participated in a week, 20, 30,000 people in a week of frenzied conversions. The heat, the noise, the confusion were overwhelming. Ministers, sometimes half dozen, preaching at the same time on different, tree stumps, wagons, and hundreds, if not thousands of people fell on the ground, moaning and groaning, wailing in remorse, and they sang, laughed, jerked in excitement. Now, America had known religious revivals before, but nothing quite like this. Now, of course, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was accompanied by the pouring out of lots of intoxicating spirits, and critics of the excesses of this Cane Ridge experience claimed that the frenzied excitement resulted in more souls being conceived than converted. Nonetheless, it became the symbol of this new kind of evangelical, both the promises and the excesses of this new kind of evangelical Protestantism spreading, particularly in the West. And it touched off an outburst of religious chaos and inventiveness unmatched in American history. Not only did you have Baptist and Methodist, who after all had European roots. But you have new religions that nobody had ever heard of before, like the Shakers or the Universalists, and lots of them that came up, bloomed for a year or two and then disappeared, and some of them we have not ever recovered. Some have in the next decade. Of course, you have the Mormons, but there were, for every group like the Mormons who thrived, there were others that had just been forgotten, led by some charismatic leader, particularly women. Jemina Wilkinson became a female Jesus Christ in the eyes of her followers, and she, until she died, she had many followers, and when she died, her sect just disappeared. But there were countless numbers of these kinds of evangelicals that were just forgotten, haven't been recovered by historians, but we know there were lots of this kind of excess. What's going on? There are lots of people cut loose from the normal organized society and seeking solace in some kind of religious. I know that sounds like Obama, but I think that's probably true of this period, that people are really lost, but finding in the message of these evangelical preachers some kind of comfort for their sense of disconnectedness, if you will. At the same time, the art and the literature of the period, there were such high hopes for American art, painting and writing, that the torch of Western civilization was passed to them and so on, and it all goes sour. It became, instead of shining brighter, it becomes perverted, democratized, popularized, much to the chagrin of the elites. I'll give you one example of this. There are many examples from paintings and so on, but John Marshall, our Chief Justice, wrote a magnificently big, even bigger than my book, 5-volume biography of George Washington. No one wanted to read it. It's an object lesson in writing, not too big a book. Instead, they wanted to read Parson Weems's short little biography, which he got out right away, and it became the best-selling biography of George Washington. It still is. It's still in print, and everybody read it. Marshall, in his innocence, dismissed Washington's youth in a single page. And of course, Parson Weems devotes most of his book to Washington's youth, which he made up, of course. The cherry tree myth and all of the great myths of Washington's life come out of Weems. But he sold, Marshall didn't. People, and of course this seemed to be to people who were aware of the great noble, ennobling art of history writing, this was a great perversion, that someone like Weems would be the champion. So by 1815, this world of the founders was passing and a new generation was taking over. And many of these founders who lived into the 19th century, Franklin fortunately died in 1790, never saw any of these perversions, were disillusioned with what they had wrought. They were disillusioned because they had so many illusions. Now, I think we need a little, we must realize, looking back at them, why did they do this? Why did they think that? But, somebody's going to look back at us 200 years from now and say, what could they have been thinking? We live with illusions too, and we just don't know what they are. They thought they could deal with the native peoples, the Indians, in a humane and respectful manner. They thought that the settlement in the West could be controlled and orderly, and Henry Knox wrote letter after letter he was Secretary of War in charge of Indian Affairs. He wrote letters to Washington outlining what he thought ought to be done. These letters would be respected by a modern anthropologist. He's very sensitive to Indian culture. We don't want the Indians to go the way they did apparently in New England. He thought that Indians had been wiped out in New England. They hadn't been entirely wiped out, as we know from the new gambling casinos that have arisen in the last 30, 40 years. But but he was concerned about these Indians, and these letters are really quite remarkable in their sensitivity to the peculiarities of Indian culture. Of course, he never conceded that the Indians could keep all of this land for hunting and gathering. They would have to become farmers because that would be just too much land. But he wanted to somehow have the settlement of the West be so orderly that we could keep the Indians intact, the Indian culture could be maintained. Of course, he had nothing. He's writing back in Philadelphia, and what's going on, as we say, on the ground is a very different thing. These white settlers were not about to respect Indian lines, boundaries, and they simply moved in and created problems that led to bloodshed and forced the Washington administration to protect them, to send in the army to protect them. And at the same time, the states, New York particularly in violation of the Constitution, was negotiating all kinds of deals with the Indians. Of course, the Constitution says Indian affairs is an exclusive monopoly of the federal government, but New York and other states pay no attention to that. They're paying for it now because they have to pay them off with casino rights. But it was simply uncontrollable because of what people wanted on the ground. They also thought that slavery would naturally disappear, especially with the ending of the international slave trade in 1808. Although, and as I say, slavery was abolished in the North, it expanded in the southern states, and they couldn't have been more wrong about the future of slavery. But there was misleading evidence, as I mentioned, in this state in particular, and of course, in the eyes of Northerners, as Virginia went, well, then the whole South will go. And there were lots of manumissions in this state in 1780, about 30,000. Freedom suits were being brought by anti-slave societies in Virginia and in the Upper South generally, in Maryland. Freedom suits brought by anti-slave societies, which were more numerous in the Upper South than in the northern states. And these would be brought by these societies, and if a black could show that he or she had an Indian ancestor, the whole line would be freed. The Indian blood could cleanse the whole thing. And that meant a lot of slaves were gaining their freedom through these freedom suits, which are usually brought by anti-slave societies. So you have a misleading notion that slavery was dying, that the South was about to, as Virginia goes, so don't want the rest of the South. And the North was confused. The awakening, of course, occurs with the Missouri problem. The North comes to realize that the South is not getting rid of slavery. Sort of scales fall from their eyes. How could they have not known? But nonetheless, they had this misleading notion that slavery was going to die. And Southerners come to realize that the North really does care about abolishing slavery. And I think from that moment on, the Civil War of some sort, the sectional split becomes apparent and becomes serious, and it seems almost inevitable that some kind of conflict would have to take place. So there are lots of illusions of that sort in the period, but I think we need a lot of humility in going back to look at the past, because, as I say, we live with illusions too. In fact, I think the best lesson that history can teach us is not particular things, how to deal with particular events, because nothing is repeatable in quite that sense, but humility. I think history teaches wisdom. It teaches you to understand. It gives you a tragic sense of life, of the limitations of life, that everything is not immediately possible. In that sense, it's not something that Americans have much favored. We're not a historically minded people because we have a lot of confidence in what we can do. But I think that history as a discipline acts as a kind of restraint on some of that exuberance, some of that. It takes you off the roller coaster of emotions that you can do this or you can't do that, and gives you a more level-headed approach, a more wise approach to the future. So I think that is what I would say is the ultimate lesson of history. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take questions about any aspect of this period. Yes, sir.
I really appreciate that lecture. But when you look at the specific examples that you gave, I'm still not convinced that the early republic was so radically different from the colonial period. You had popular political parties in the North in the colonial period, and as well as in the early republic. Population doubled every generation in the colonial period. Geographic expansion of the United States double every generation before and after. Slavery was entrenched in the North, I mean in the South, but not in the North in the colonial period too. Religious revivals throughout in the colonial period in the North. So what do you think were the really,
Well,
areas that really were radical differences, other than the obvious replacement of a British Empire with America?
Well, you're right about the population increase, although the geographical expansion did not occur in the colonial period. They're really bottled in by the mountains, and they don't cross the Appalachians. In religion, I think the changes are enormous. Although there are no political parties as such, there are factions of a sort always condemned in the colonial period. And of course, there's no national system at all. These are colonial colonies, separate colonies whose tie is to London, and they don't know much about each other. They're tied to the metropolitan center. There is, of course, some, I mean, compared to Britain, compared to the mother country, America is already a much more popular, loose society. So I don't mean to say that it suddenly comes out of nowhere. There certainly is anticipations of the kind of changes. The intensification is greater, is what I'm saying. Of course, the society is very weak by European standards. There's no European-type aristocracy. They talked about aristocrats, but Alexander Hamilton's hardly an aristocrat in the European sense of the term. There are no great houses similar to what you have in Great Britain. Any of you have been to England and seen these country houses, like the Duke of Rockingham's house in Northumberland, that's his country house, is 650 feet long. That's longer than 2 football fields. There's nothing like that, even in Virginia, which had a very substantial aristocracy of a sort. But Westover at Bird's house in Westover on the James River was, 90 feet long. I mean, the scale of our aristocracy is kind of minor gentry. Jefferson, even for all of his slaves, Washington, despite having 200 or 300 slaves, is still, by European English standards, is minor gentry. So you're quite right about that. But still, there's a good deal of deference still. People expect the people who go to the House of Burgesses to be major landowners, to be substantial people. The same is true in the North. You just don't have people who are going to be at the top making decisions who have no education and are proud of it. Franklin's rise is often looked back on, but Franklin, assimilated into gentry status immediately. I mean, he became a wealthy gentleman. He's not he doesn't go around talking about the printer. Being a printer, his autobiography is published after his death, and is used by entrepreneurs in the North to justify their own rise. But Franklin, in his own lifetime, is seen. They knew that he had started as an obscure person, but so didn't Thomas Cromwell, so didn't Cardinal Wolsey. That isn't the important point. The important point is that you now have obscure people who are proud of their obscure origins and make no effort to hide it. That's a real big difference. So I don't disagree with you that the society is a much looser one compared to Europe or England. But it is the intensification of this popularization. It's almost as if the society comes apart in the North. I think that those changes that I'm talking about occur in a relatively short period of time. But they have antecedents. There's no doubt of that. And it all starts right from the first, the aristocracy the nobles never came here. It's an important point that Louis Hart made 50 years ago, that somehow the migration was always, at most, John Winthrop was just minor gentry. He becomes governor of the Commonwealth or the colony of Massachusetts. When they tried to get, in Virginia, in Jamestown, the authority was already so skewed. They gave a knighthood to one of the first governors, hoping that will instill some authority in him. We had a major problem through our whole history of a weak aristocracy. It's the secret to American social life. Anybody who wanted to be a leader from the very beginning was vulnerable to challenge. There's always someone else who said, why are you there and not me? Now, what happens in the revolution is an acceleration and intensification of that process to the point where it really confused Europeans who saw it. They couldn't believe it, that this clodhopper could become a governor of the state, a big state like Pennsylvania. So that, you're right about the antecedents, because that's the main theme of American social history, is the weakness of our leadership, of our aristocracy. They just don't have the credentials to avoid being challenged constantly. Governor Berkeley here, Barclay, with Bacon's Rebellion, was all about that. He didn't have enough. Bacon had more credentials in his mind than Barclay did. And he says, why is he running the show and not me? That kind of challenge was built in from the beginning. That's a long-winded answer to your question. It was a big question, an important one. Yes, sir. Oh, Ed.
We'll talk about the second of the big surprises of the spread of slavery.
Yeah.
You could argue, picking up on Lee Holtman's question, that this was the most important thing that happened because it was the biggest diversion from what had happened before. And that the South has transportation revolution, really, those steam boats sort of transformed the rivers early on. The rate of expansion pointing out Kentucky grows 8 times. Cane Ridge
Right.
spreads to evangelical religions in a slave society. We're the product of Baptists in 1830 out in the middle of some field. So I wonder how you would explain that in slavery, how could it pivot so from apparently, and I agree, that all the indications are it's going to fade away, to really, in a really short time, 15 years, just like that in American history, to become this, what will soon become the most dynamic part of the economy in terms of accounting for exports. So I just want to add what you had to say.
Well, I think that, the changes in terms of religion, for example, it isn't as, from the scholarship that's been written recently, the evangelical religion doesn't spread as rapidly in the South at first. It runs into the, slavery really dictates the contours of the social structure. Authority remains relatively hierarchical. The crop, even if it's cotton, new cotton is similar to what tobacco was. It's not, it has limited markets. It's very important for patrons. Small cotton farmers need to look up to they have no access to the Liverpool market, so they have to deal with big shots in the way that small farmers had to deal with the Birds and the Lees in Virginia earlier with tobacco. Very similar kinds of crops in the limited markets, and you don't need distribution centers. That's why there are no towns growing up in the South, relatively few towns. When Northern Virginia turns to wheat, as Washington did, then Norfolk emerges, because wheat is a perishable crop and it has diverse markets. So you have very different developments. The South remains, I think, for a long period of time, much more stratified, much more hierarchical. When the South says on the eve of the Civil War, and you're the expert on this, I'm not, but when they say, look, we've been more faithful to the founders and the world of the founders than you Northerners have, they were absolutely right. It's the North that changes. Now, it's true that Southern economy, export economy, is allowing for the importation of goods from Britain. And it's our export, major export, and it's feeding the economy. But the dynamic economy of middle-class society is taking place in the North, and measured in a host of different ways. Number of newspapers, number of lawyers, if that's a measure of commercial development, number of middling sorts of people, engineers, everything. I mean, there are more newspapers in Ohio within the first few years of its existence than existed in Georgia after 100 years of its existence. So all of these measures of what we call a modern commercial society are growing much faster in the North, but it is sustained by the export of cotton. Now that's why the tariff becomes so important. Now when I was in high school or college, and people said, my God, we almost came to a civil war over the tariff. It always seems strange to me. Why would the Southerners give a damn about, what's the nullification controversy? Why would they care about the tariff? Well, you have to understand, if the Brits can't sell their manufactured goods to the United States, they're not going to buy Southern cotton. I mean, it's that kind of simple. The South was not stupid in its fear of tariffs. They just didn't think the Northerners were a sufficient market for their cotton, and if they cut off the British ability to buy, to sell their own goods in the United States, which was a great market, then the South would get hurt. So that's my... Oh, the cotton gin would have happened. I mean, Whitney gets all the credit, but look, it's a problem. Trying to get that cotton, I forget the name of the kind of cotton it is, but to do it by hand, I mean, you measured your day's work in ounces. And it was sooner or later some bright mechanical-minded guy is going to invent some kind of engine, which is what gin means, and do that. So Whitney just gets a lot of credit for it, but somebody else would have done that. But that did revolutionize the production of this short fiber cotton. Yeah, that's the term. And of course, within a decade, it really is enormous growth of cotton exports. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was wondering why this change towards commerce and equality is so unanticipated by the founders, particularly because of the picture you give them as a distinct classical learning, and presumably would have the idea of a cycle of regimes available to them to interpret what's happening. And according to that idea, you expect precisely an aristocracy to generate an oligarchy or democracy, which is a regime put into virtue or honor, to change to a regime where money or equality is the
Right.
So why don't they anticipate?
They don't anticipate. Well, I'm not clear why they should anticipate it. Now, they did have a notion of stages of development, which were made famous by the Scottish philosophers writing at the time, Smith and Hume and others, from hunter-gatherer to herding to agriculture to commercial activity. So people like Hamilton anticipated commercial activity, but he thought it would be, how to put it, would not be as democratic as it was. You know, his biggest political mistake, Hamilton's biggest political mistake, is to ignore the middling artisans in Pennsylvania, New York, elsewhere. He has a hierarchical conception of society, and he concentrates on the big merchants, the big money men. He ignores these artisans who are really the future businessmen. And they were natural allies of the Federalists. They really are responsible in many of the cities for carrying the Constitution. They vote for this new Constitution. But under the Hamilton's regime, they're ignored, and they become rabid Republicans. The irony of the business is extraordinary. Jefferson's leading a party. The Southern leadership has no awareness, no real awareness of what they're creating in the North. The Northern Republicans are petty businessmen, small, middling sorts of people who bring out. The founders, I don't think, anticipated the kind of democratization of commercial activity that took place. No one could have. I mean, it's not happening in Britain. Britain is having an industrial revolution, but what's extraordinary in Britain is that the political leadership remains in the hands of the landed gentry. And the whole transformation of England occurs, so to speak, under this political landed gentry leadership. That doesn't happen in America. There is nothing comparable to that landed gentry leadership except in the South. And the closest you got to it is the Virginia gentry, the Southern aristocracy. The South remains as close to a European model in terms of political leadership as you would have, but the North goes wild. It's just unbelievable, licentious, tumultuous behavior with all kinds of odd characters getting to be governors, and a celebration of work unprecedented in the history of the world and by European standards. Europeans come to this much more slowly, to the idea that work is a good thing. You know, through history, read Aristotle. He says people who work for a living are ignoble. They're incapable of virtue. That's not a message that Northern Americans buy into. Southerners continue to think like that because they're a leisured aristocracy. Once you celebrate work, then slavery becomes more anomalous. You know, in the colonial period, slavery is not as conspicuous as it would become in the early 19th century. There's lots of degrees of unfreedom. And slavery had existed in societies for thousands of years, not necessarily like the plantation slavery of the New World, but nonetheless, slavery was a fact that went back to as far back in history as you could imagine. And the first criticism of it, serious criticism, occurs with the American Revolution. And as the North grows and becomes more commercial, celebrating work, then the idea of a leisured aristocracy becomes more and more of an aberration, an anomaly. And the institution gets to be called a peculiar institution. Nobody called slavery a peculiar institution in the colonial period. There were whites who were being bought and sold. Now, they didn't have hereditary. White servants weren't, and they didn't serve for life, except in some cases prisoners and convicts maybe. But by and large, there was a sense that this was just the most base and level of a whole society filled with unfreedom. You know, half the society had experienced servitude. So servitude disappears almost entirely by 1800 in the North. You know, half the society in Philadelphia were servants in the colonial period. So what does that mean? To get rid of all your servants, people are no longer bonded. They can't be bought and sold. They're free to, this is what freedom meant to people. That's gone. Suddenly, slavery's gone. Suddenly, the South looks very different. And from that moment on, the South is on the defensive, I think, trying to defend itself against a North which has got very different cultural and economic activities. They just couldn't have anticipated that. Yes, ma'am.
I just wonder if you could say a little about what role the relationship with the indigenous Indian population played in the texture of life in that period.
Well, the Indians in New England had seemingly disappeared. Actually, they'd intermarried with blacks, and they were lost, so to speak, to history. They get recovered in our own time, actually. The Pequods, when you know, Foxwoods is in Connecticut, it's the biggest gambling outfit, single outfit in the world. 500 Pequods came out of the woodwork to claim base. So Indians didn't die away, and they're making a great deal of their presence now, but they did seem to die away. But most people did not experience Indians in a day-to-day basis. Jefferson loved to talk about Indians. He knew more about Indians than any other single person probably in America, collected their languages, unfortunately lost in an accident. But I don't think day-to-day life, except on the frontier, was where you'd have much contact with Indians. And in the West, it turned bloody. It was just their land was being taken from them. And whites were encroaching on it, and they reacted by killing. And then the whites reacted by killing back, and you had an escalation. And Washington, for example, most of his foreign policy was devoted to dealing with Indians, this Indian problem. And he had to send troops there to end it. It's a tragedy from beginning to end, because there was I don't think there was any way of averting the tragedy, because the whites were not going to allow all this land to remain for hunters. And the Indians had a hard time adjusting to agriculture. Cherokees did, but most Indians took the view that that's for women. Their women did their farming. And they were hunters. They had an aristocratic notion. Males did. We hunt, we fight. We don't do farming. That's what women do. Very hard to convince them culturally that they should behave differently. It's just an impossible cultural impasse. And the numbers, the demographic numbers were, we're talking about 4 million people, 1790, and whites, and you've got, at most, east of the Mississippi, 70,000 Indians. So, the demographics are working against them, and have worked right through our whole history. Yes, sir. Oh, and then, go ahead.
Discuss federalism from this era, and whether the decline of federalism was even began.
Well, we were the United States of America, and we were a plural nation. These United States are until the Civil War. The Civil War is a very important change in our national. People thought about the states. See, this is the problem that Washington faces. Most people's loyalty were to their country. My country is Virginia. That's what John Randolph would say. And that's what John Adams said. My country's Massachusetts. So think of it in terms of the EU today, trying to build loyalty to something abstract called Europe. How do you do that for the United States? Now, the one thing we had an advantage over the Europeans, we had the Revolution, which acted as an ideological force that gave Americans a sense of distinctiveness. That was a very powerful force that gave a national consciousness. But by and large, people thought about their states the way the Brits would think about Britain or the Germans would think about Germany today. That's where their loyalties went. They went back a century or more. So how do you get this new country to have any, this is the problem that Washington faced. How do I develop the sinews of union? And he uses that term over and over again. We've got to hold the union together. How do I mean, he and Arthur engaged in matchmaking. They would fix up a northern congressman with a southern belle, hoping that, I mean, he thought of marriage in dynastic terms, and this will help unite the nation, because they already saw a sectional split. So by 1810, after Jefferson comes in and eliminates almost virtually all of Hamilton's program, except the bank, which he was stuck with because it was a contract, but they soon get rid of it when the charter expires. You wouldn't know you lived in the United States. You wouldn't know there was a federal government except for the delivery of the mail. How would you know? There are no taxes. Tariffs aren't felt by you. They're paid at the port. So you, except for your mail delivery, you would have no sense you were living in a federal government. The world is totally different today, obviously, and there's no going back to that. Although I suppose there are people who would like to do that, but I just don't think that's going to happen. That's the federalism. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Can I ask you a question about boundaries? You wrote about the empire, and most of your talk is about this particular time period. You say
Yeah.
Americans are looking for an identity. They want to create an identity.
Right.
Most historians treat the American Revolutions, they accept the fact there's 13 colonies that participate, they become the 13 states, the draft the Constitution, and then you start the rest of it. Well, looking at it as a historian of the period, how do you account for the fact that there's 13 colonies and only 13 and not 14? Why not?
Oh, there were 22 colonies, British colonies.
Right. Why does this kind of ideological outburst that gives rise to the revolution occur in these 13 and not the rest?
Well,
And why these 13 and not 11, for example?
well, they were the continental colonies. Obviously, there's Jamaica and there's Barbados, and if you read their objections to the Stamp Act in 1765 from Jamaica or Barbados, from their assemblies, they're indistinguishable from those objectives. But when push came to shove, for obvious reasons, these islands don't participate. You can almost guess what the reasons would be. Slavery. Look, the population of Jamaica was 10 to 1, black over white. So the revolution isn't exactly what you think of doing. Besides, they're islands, and Britain controls the ocean. So there's a lot of reasons. Now, there is a small British colony in Canada, but it's so insignificant and so small without any. They might have agreed they don't like taxes and so on, but they're not about to lead a revolution. So it's understandable that these continental colonies would be the ones. Now Georgia feels very threatened. They're very anxious to be with the others. They don't want to be isolated. So I think, but Florida, for example, is well, that's a consequence of they had Florida, but there's not a colony yet. Not really a British colony. So I think you can make a case that, but why the revolution becomes so important is because it's not just a colonial rebellion like the Algerians breaking away from France in the 1960s. It occurs at a peculiar moment in history, the so-called Enlightenment, we historians call it, when optimism, the sense that the future could be remade by human beings, I mean, we take that for granted, but that very few people in the history of the world ever thought that they were controlling their society and culture in the way people did in the 18th century. So Americans come to this with this vision that they're leading the world towards a new kind of well, democracy. They use republic, but that's confusing to us now because we talk in terms of democracy, but that's what they meant, democracy. The world is dominated by monarchs. You got to get rid of monarchs, create republics. Jefferson felt, do that and you'll end war. He thought war was caused by monarchies. You get rid of monarchs and you'll have peace, universal peace. It's a grand dream, and we still live with that. I mean, the revolution created everything we believe in. Equality, liberty, the institutions of our government, and the sense that we have a responsibility to bring democracy to the whole world. Not necessarily by sending troops, but when Reagan talked about a city on the hill, when Wilson talked about it, when Bush justified going into Iraq, he said, we're bringing democracy to the Middle East. That's drawing on this history that goes back to the revolution. So our revolution was a world historical event, not an ordinary little colonial rebellion. It has all of these ideological elements, and we are the most ideological people, or one of the most ideological peoples in the world, in the history of the world. And our whole history has been an effort to promote that kind of democracy. You know, through the 19th century, with one exception, we were the first state in the world to recognize the new Republican regimes. Most of them were aborted. The Latin Americans, we supported. French Revolution, we were the first. The one exception you can all know, Haiti, right, didn't recognize it until Lincoln, for obvious reasons. But otherwise we did. 1848, we were right there. Well, it's amazing to me when you read the diplomatic messages of, say, someone like Daniel Webster, Secretary of State. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is protesting the encouragement that the United States is giving to these new Republican regimes that have been set up. They eventually are overturned, but for a moment there, it looked as if all of Europe was aflame. And what does Webster do? He doesn't hide behind any diplomatic niceness. He says, yes, we take full responsibility for the spread of republicanism or democracy in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. We are the source of their revolution. And then he adds in a really incredible sentence, he says, besides, he says, compared to the United States, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is but a patch on the Earth's surface. I mean, this kind of bombast, this is diplomatic bombast of a sort that just no other, the diplomacy of the Europeans was not like that at all. It's sort of similar to what the Soviets were like when they first created their revolution. Now, that's another story, how we reacted to 1917. I'll tell you, because it's interesting, because it reveals a lot about ourselves. The first revolution in Russia takes place. The Tsar resigned. 7 days later, we recognize the new Russian Republic, the first state in the world to do so. Wilson thinks he's got a fit partner now for his League of Democracies. I mean, it fulfills our greatest dream. We expect the whole world, monarchies to crumble everywhere, and here's the Russian Revolution doing just that. Then the Soviets take over, the communists take over, the Bolsheviks take over in the fall. Everything changes, completely different. We're not the first state, we're the last state, major state. Ireland, I think, was the last major state in the world to recognize the Soviet regime. Incredible change. Why? We'd always been the first. The change is because the Soviet Union offered a counter universalist vision of the future. All of the other revolutions in our mind were species of the revolutionary genus Americanus. That's why we could accept them. We even told President Grant sends a message to the French after their Republican Revolution they overthrow the Third French Empire in 1870 and establish the Third Republic, and Grant sends a message saying, congratulations on adopting American principles of republicanism, as if the French had no Republican tradition. So that was our vision. The Soviet Union represented a real challenge to that vision. That's why, the Cold War starts in 1917. This is a rival revolutionary ideology with the same kind of universalist aspirations that we had. And that really explains a lot of our behavior over the subsequent, 3/4 of a century. I mean, you go back to Kennedy's inaugural address. We'll bear any burden, pay any price in defense of liberty. We thought the Soviet Union, many people thought it was the future. China went communist. I mean, the Marshall Plan was based on keeping France and Italy from going communist. We really were scared that the world was going off in this other direction. And there were intellectuals in this country who said, yes, that's the future and that's the way we should go. So it was a terrifying moment for a country that was built on a dream that we were the future. And I think you can explain the Cold War, why we were in Vietnam. Now that's all gone. In 1989 it collapsed, and we don't know what we're supposed to do. I think there's confusion. History will sort it out for us, but we just don't know quite what we're supposed to do anymore. We're supposed to be, the end of history. Fukuyama told us it was the end of history, and others said no. Clash of Civilizations, Huntington said no. The Islamic world. It's hard to believe that terrorists from Islam are a real threat to the United States in any fundamental sense, except in our own minds. But we're living through this, and I don't think we know what's happening. One more. I'll get this one fellow here.
Last question. Can I ask you, it's kind of a personal opinion question, who do you think had more of an effect on forming the American executive branch, Hamilton or Washington?
Oh, I think it's Washington. He's the president. He developed a sense of how he would operate. He gave an enormous amount of authority to Hamilton because the Constitution sort of suggested that. The Constitution provides for the Secretary of the Treasury to report directly to the Congress. And so Washington paid a lot of deference to him. And Hamilton saw himself as a kind of Robert Walpole, a kind of prime minister to Washington, the president. But Washington really developed an executive practice of having these individuals, which were his appointees, report to him. He's kind of the hub of a wheel. He took a lot of advice, but I think he was the perfect executive in a sense, if you're going to talk about executive leadership. And Jefferson, for all of his dislikes of the Federalists, he tells his cabinet when he takes office as president, he says, I'm going to tell you how President Washington did it, and I think that's a good way of running an administration. And so in that sense, Washington was very crucial in setting up, treating these men who reported to him essentially as his agents. He never, except with the slight deference towards Hamilton, which he did anyhow, because Hamilton was so smart, so bright, and knew about economics in a way that no other, certainly not Jefferson, none of the other founders understood banking or any of that. So he deferred to him, but he accepted Hamilton's judgment. But he was also a nationalist. He wanted to do what Hamilton wanted to do. He wanted to build up the United States. And in the meantime, it's going to take 4 decades. Let's avoid war. I think Washington deserves the credit as being the first, in many respects, the first president in our listing, if we do that, because of the challenges that he faced and the way he worked out the nature of the office. He could have developed somewhat differently. He knew that. We're setting precedents, he said. Very self-conscious about that. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Good.
Professor Wood, I know I speak for everyone here when I thank you for a great story greatly told. It's a wonderful evening to be with you. We now have a reception on this side, and we have books available and signing on this side. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us.
I'll go sign some books.
There you go.